And right now, President Biden is on his way back to the U.S. after his high-level trip to Asia. He met overnight with top officials in Vietnam. The visit follows the G20 summit in India, another important venue for U.S. efforts to keep China from throwing its weight around. Ed O'Keefe is in Hanoi, Vietnam. Ed, good morning.
Good morning from Vietnam, Anne-Marie. Good to see you. The president, as you said, is on his way back to the United States at this point. You know, Vietnam shares a border and a long history with China, but with the president's first ever visit to this country, the U.S. and Vietnam are now looking to put the pain of the past behind them in order to maintain stability in this region. A warm welcome from Vietnam amid a weekend of meetings on the world stage. The trip began Friday in India and was seen as a way to continue building a network of allies to pressure China to play by international rules.
I am sincere about getting the relationship right.
But a new CBS News poll finds 57% of Americans believe the president's being too easy on China. He said being tough isn't the solution.
We're not looking to hurt China, sincerely. We're all better off if China does well.
Republicans criticized that stance.
This is a wrong message to send. It was not one of deterrence.
Still, the president's re-election campaign is sending its own message about leadership on the global stage, launching part of a $25 million ad campaign in 7 battleground states.
Joe Biden walks shoulder to shoulder with our allies in the war-torn streets.
That highlights the president's February trip to Ukraine. But at the G20 summit in India, Mr. Biden couldn't get all of the world's major powers to agree on a full condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Instead, a joint declaration merely expressed concern for the suffering of the Ukrainian people.
I think the statement's a very strong one. Virtually every member of the G20, perhaps minus one, is intent on making sure that there is a just and durable end to this Russian aggression.
Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping skipped the G20 summit, but President Biden told us he had a conversation with China's number 2, who was in attendance. That's notable because he's been trying to get a meeting with Xi on the books, and perhaps it's a precursor to that. He said the conversation with the number 2, quote, wasn't confrontational at all. He is now en route to Alaska, where Air Force One will refuel. And while he's at Elmendorf Air Force Base, he will meet with members of the military, first responders, and their families, and address the nation on the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Anne-Marie?
All right, Ed, I have a few things to ask you about. I think I'm going to start with Vietnam. Can we talk a little bit more about why Vietnam is so important to Washington these days? And as I understand it, it was the Vietnamese who sort of really reached out and wanted this meeting.
That's right. And remember, if you look at the map, Vietnam sits just south of China. And strategically, historically, they've had incredibly close relations, especially with China and with Russia. But they've decided to do something now that elevates the United States, in their view, to the same level as those 2 countries, plus India and South Korea, establishing what they call a comprehensive strategic partnership, which ultimately means at the top of that partnership, Vietnam's likely to end up purchasing even more U.S. military equipment from us for its use down the line. That helps sort of rebalance things, at least in the eyes of the United States, at a time when China's seeing an economic downturn, is saber-rattling across the region, both on ground and in the air and on the seas, and at a time when Russia, of course, is increasingly isolated for its ongoing war with Ukraine and may be on the verge of a bigger partnership with North Korea. So the president, yes, was asked in the spring to consider taking this visit. He announced in July he would, and he made what was essentially a 24-hour stop, perhaps most notably at the end of it, making a stop at the lake nearby here where the late Senator John McCain was shot down over the skies of the city and then held as a prisoner of war for 5.5 years. I was struck, I had no idea, Anne-Marie, 50 years in American foreign policy, a guy who had covered it as a senator and a vice president, now president, had never been here to Vietnam. And he knew McCain when he was a naval aide to senators back in the 1980s, was a close friend of his, and alongside his other colleague, John Kerry, today, they visited that lake and the memorial that's been established to that crash site. it was an important personal stop for the president before he flew home.
Yeah, I'm sure it was quite emotional for him. Let me ask you about the G20 summit and something that came out of it, a declaration that the member nations supported, a commentary on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but some have said that the language was not quite as strong as it had been, with previous declarations.
Right, and even so good for Russia, in fact, that the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, today was telling reporters that the summit was a great success because they had gotten democracies around the world to sign off on what was essentially a watered-down version of a declaration of concern they made last year when the group met in Indonesia. The White House would tell you, as long as there was something about Ukraine in the declaration, they saw it as a good thing. And they noted that China and Russia signed off on it, despite the fact that their top leaders weren't there. It expresses concern about the suffering of the Ukrainian people, but doesn't, as you point out, further condemn the war in Ukraine. And why would an organization that's established to focus on dollars and cents, not matters of war and peace, even weigh in at all? Because the United States, European powers, and others have said this war not only terrible for the people of Ukraine, but it's become a drag on the global economy. For example, Russia blocking the export of wheat from Ukraine to the Middle East and Africa is going to cause a further food crisis, which will drive up prices, increased demand for diminished supply. It's a real economic problem, in addition, of course, to all the security concerns that exist.
And quickly, not really quickly, but what else came out of the G20 summit? Anything else that sort of was concrete, or is it also kind of ceremonial?
So this is the kind of thing that really excites and is important to the president, but I think is harder for people back home to understand. He talks a lot about infrastructure across the United States, and we're going to see over the coming years the tens of billions of dollars spent on domestic infrastructure. Well, they put together a plan at the G20 that's in essence going to establish a real hefty amount of infrastructure across India, the Middle East, and Europe. There's a plan now for sort of a sea and rail route that will run from India into the Middle East, up through Turkey and on to Europe. The argument being this helps move goods more quickly across that region, connects India better to the Western world, boosts economic development in the Middle East, and intertwines these parts of the world even more closely at a time when the United States and Europe especially want India talking and spending with them versus talking and spending more often with China and Russia. So White House was thrilled about this international infrastructure announcement. Thing is, they didn't say how long this will take, how much it'll cost, who's paying for it. But to get 20 countries, everyone from the United States to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the European countries, and India on board with something like that, they believe is a big sign of how the Biden administration is bringing together the world, at least the Western and developing world, at a time when China and Russia are obviously also trying to have influence across those regions.
Yeah, it sort of almost reminded me a little, and I was quickly trying to Google as you were talking. I think it was China's Belt and what is it? Belt and Road Initiative,
right.
Something along those lines, right? Trying to rival what
exactly.
China had been attempting to do. So listen, while I got you here, and no one's telling me to wrap yet, let me ask you a little bit about politics back at home. President Biden, can you tell us a little bit more about his re-election campaign, launching a $25 million campaign ad?
It's part of a $25 million ad campaign across at least 7 battleground states. If you were watching 60 Minutes in one of these battleground states last night, you may have seen the ad that played during our report. They're trying now to remind people that he's obviously been focused so much on foreign policy and that they believe the work he's done to unite the world on Ukraine's side against Russia's war is something worth re-electing him for. But it came on the same day, notably, that CBS News released a new poll that found 50% of Americans believe the president has made the country weaker across the world. 57% believe he isn't being tough enough on China, and 71% are pessimistic about the prospects for world peace. So clearly the campaign understands they've got to reverse those kinds of numbers and hope that that's one reason people will end up supporting him next year.
Really interesting stuff. Ed, thank you so much.